The most dangerous secrets are not the ones whispered to journalists, but the ones delivered directly to institutions that cannot pretend they never saw them. This document did not seek attention. It sought consequence. And that distinction explains why Prince Harry's reaction was not anger, not denial, but something far more revealing: paralysis. For years, the palace managed the Sussex situation through containment. Silence was the currency. Distance was the strategy. The assumption was simple: time would dull curiosity, and public fatigue would bury unresolved questions. But the arrival of this document shattered that assumption entirely. Because for the first time, the questions were no longer coming from outsiders. They were coming from inside the system that defines royal legitimacy itself. What made this leak uniquely devastating was not what it alleged, but where it landed. Parliamentary officials are not commentators. They are not critics. They are custodians of constitutional order. Once the document was opened, it could not be unseen, unfiled, or quietly dismissed as speculation. It entered a process that does not care about narratives, feelings, or modern sensibilities. It cares about definitions. And this is where Prince Harry miscalculated. The royal family is often mistaken for a family business driven by emotion and loyalty. It is not. It is a legal organism sustained by precedent and paperwork. The palace will tolerate embarrassment. It will tolerate resentment. What it will not tolerate is ambiguity in succession law. The moment ambiguity becomes provable, protection becomes liability. Harry had lived for years believing the institution would always choose discretion over exposure. That belief shaped every interview, every accusation, every monetized grievance. What he failed to understand was that discretion is conditional. And conditions change when silence threatens the system itself. The insider who leaked the document understood this perfectly. This was not rebellion. It was alignment with the only thing that ultimately matters inside royal power structures: continuity. The leak was not an act of betrayal against a prince. It was an act of loyalty to the crown as an institution. And once that choice was made, the outcome was inevitable. Because when a system built on bloodlines is forced to examine bloodlines, there is no room left for storytelling. And that was only the beginning. Prince Harry did not panic when the document surfaced. Panic would have implied surprise. What those close to the situation describe instead is something colder and far more dangerous: as recognition. The instant understanding that the story he had lived inside for 5 years was no longer a story at all. It had become a jurisdictional problem. And jurisdiction is where sentiment goes to die. For years, the Sussex narrative relied on a single, fragile assumption: that personal truth could override institutional law. That if something felt morally justified, it would eventually be accepted as legally legitimate. That assumption works in interviews. It works in documentaries. It collapses instantly when confronted by statutes written to survive centuries, not headlines. The moment the leaked document entered parliamentary channels, the question was no longer what happened, but where it happened. Geography, not emotion, became the axis on which everything turned. California versus Britain. Contract law versus constitutional law. Intended parenthood versus biological descent. These distinctions may sound technical to the public, but inside the monarchy, they are existential. The British Crown does not operate on modern family definitions. It operates on blood, location, and sequence. Every monarch inherits not just a throne, but a legal framework designed to prevent manipulation of succession by convenience or innovation. The phrase "born of the body" was not written to shame anyone. It was written to eliminate ambiguity. And ambiguity is exactly what this document introduced in its most dangerous form. What stunned Harry was not that questions were being asked. Questions had followed him since 2019. What stunned him was that the questions were now being asked by people who did not need his cooperation to answer them. The document spoke in a language interviews never could. Dates. Locations. Classifications. The kind of language that does not bend under pressure. The California connection was the first crack that widened into a fault line. If the birth occurred under American jurisdiction, then British royal protocol was irrelevant at the moment that mattered most. No royal physicians. No palace oversight. No immediate constitutional recognition. That alone would have been damaging. But the document went further. It didn't merely suggest a foreign birth. It anchored it in a system of law that directly contradicts British succession principles. California recognizes intended parenthood. Britain does not. In California, a woman can be legally recognized as a mother without carrying a child or contributing genetic material, provided a contract exists. In Britain, especially within royal succession law, that distinction is meaningless. Contracts do not create bloodlines. Biology does. This is where the Sussex strategy quietly imploded. Everything they had relied on, privacy arguments, modernization rhetoric, emotional appeals, was irrelevant in a constitutional review. The law did not care why decisions were made. It cared whether those decisions produced a legitimate heir under existing statutes. And the leaked document suggested they did not. The second shock came not from the medical details, but from the money. Because money transforms ambiguity into intent. Investigators reviewing the accompanying financial records reportedly reached the same conclusion independently. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a managed operation. Payments aligned too precisely with medical milestones. Transfers coincided too neatly with procedural stages. This was not chaos. It was administration. The shell company structure mattered because it demonstrated forethought. Someone anticipated scrutiny. Someone anticipated the need to distance public funds from private arrangements. And most critically, someone authorized it. That authorization is where Prince Harry's position shifted irreversibly, from protected royal to accountable actor. Royal finances are not casual. Every pound allocated from public sources carries an obligation of purpose. Renovations are not interchangeable with reproductive services. Security costs are not flexible enough to absorb six-figure medical payments without explanation. The leaked records did not merely suggest misallocation. They mapped it. This is why Harry's legal team did not rush to deny the documents. Denial would have required alternative explanations for transactions that now had a narrative coherence of their own. Silence became the only viable option. But silence, in this context, was interpreted not as dignity, but as concession. Inside the palace, the tone shifted. This was no longer about managing public perception. It was about exposure to institutional risk. The monarchy can survive scandal. What it cannot survive is precedent. If one child could be introduced into the line of succession through contractual parenthood and offshore arrangements, then the entire system becomes contestable. And systems respond to threats the way organisms do, by isolating them. Harry began to feel that isolation almost immediately. Communications narrowed. Intermediaries replaced confidants. Conversations stopped being about protection and started being about resolution. The language changed. Where once there had been reassurance, there was now caution. Where there had been patience, there was now urgency. The most devastating realization came when Harry understood that the palace was no longer trying to defend him. It was trying to defend itself from him. The donor classification within the document sealed that shift. Because once donor genetics entered the equation, the discussion moved beyond surrogacy into disqualification. A surrogate birth using the father's genetics might have prompted debate. A donor egg ended it. There was no interpretive flexibility left. The child could not meet the biological threshold required by law, no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. This is the moment Harry reportedly broke. Not publicly. Not dramatically. but privately, in the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them has been quietly removed. He had believed that intention mattered. That love mattered. That modern values would eventually soften old laws. What he learned instead was that institutions do not evolve under pressure. They entrench. The palace did not accuse. It prepared. And preparation is far more dangerous. Legal teams began drafting language not aimed at punishment, but at clarification. Clarification sounds benign. It is not. Clarification is how systems erase anomalies without acknowledging them. It does not require confrontation. It requires definition. Harry's options collapsed one by one. He could not challenge the document without challenging the financial records. He could not challenge the financial records without exposing authorization. He could not expose authorization without implicating himself. Every path led inward. And then came the final blow of this phase, the understanding that silence was no longer mutual. The palace had kept its silence for years. That silence had conditions. Those conditions had been violated. And now, silence was being withdrawn. What Harry had mistaken for loyalty was always provisional. What he had mistaken for protection was always strategic. The institution had not been waiting for the truth to disappear. It had been waiting for the moment when revealing it would cause less damage than continuing to hide it. By the end of this phase, the story was no longer about Archie's birth. It was about whether Prince Harry himself could remain constitutionally intact. Not emotionally. Not reputationally. Legally. And as the palace moved toward its next step, one thing became clear to everyone involved: the monarchy was not preparing to argue. It was preparing to redefine. And once definitions change, outcomes follow. The monarchy does not argue with threats. It neutralizes them. And when it does, it prefers methods so old, so procedural, that outrage has nowhere to land. No press conference. No denunciation. No spectacle. Just a quiet adjustment to the machinery of legitimacy, after which the problem no longer exists in any meaningful sense. This is how the crown survives centuries of scandal without ever appearing to fight back. By the time Prince Harry understood what was happening, the conversation had already moved past him. Not emotionally past him, institutionally. The palace had stopped asking whether the documents were damaging and started asking how to ensure they could never damage the system again. That distinction matters. Because institutions do not seek vindication. They seek stability. The mechanism chosen was not dramatic. It never is. It was administrative. A refinement of language. A clarification of standards. The kind of change that sounds harmless until you realize it rewrites the conditions under which reality itself is recognized. Letters patent are not weapons in the modern sense. They are instruments of definition. They do not accuse. They do not punish. They simply state what is. And when what is changes, everything built on the old definition collapses without resistance. What made this approach devastating was its inevitability. The palace did not need to prove intent. It did not need to demonstrate wrongdoing beyond doubt. It only needed to establish that ambiguity existed, and that ambiguity threatened continuity. Once that threshold was met, the solution became almost automatic. The draft language circulating among constitutional advisors was clinical to the point of cruelty. Not because it sought to harm, but because it sought to be unassailable. It spoke of biological descent in terms that left no room for interpretation. Not born of love. Not born of intention. Born of biological union. The words were chosen carefully, not to target anyone, but to exclude any future claim that might resemble the present one. This is how the crown avoids appearing vindictive. It does not say you lied. It says this is the standard. If someone fails to meet that standard, the failure is theirs alone. Prince Harry's shock at this stage was not theatrical. It was existential. He had prepared himself for backlash, for lawsuits, for reputational damage. He had not prepared himself for erasure. Because erasure does not feel like defeat. It feels like vanishing. There would be no announcement naming names. No stripping ceremony. No dramatic moment for cameras to capture. The update would appear where such things always appear, quietly, formally, and without commentary. A line adjusted here. A designation placed in abeyance there. A page refreshed. And then, absence. Absence is the Crown's most effective tool. It invites no argument. It offers no target. You cannot protest what is no longer officially acknowledged. Inside the palace, the response was described as grim but resolved. No one celebrated. No one gloated. This was not revenge. It was maintenance. The monarchy had identified a fault line and sealed it. The cost was personal. The benefit was institutional. For Harry, the consequences arrived in stages. First, the communications changed. Messages came through intermediaries. Language became formal. Emotional appeals were met with procedural replies. Then the geography shifted. Distance is not just physical in royal life, it is symbolic. Being moved away from centers of influence is not exile. It is containment. He reportedly tried to negotiate. Not publicly. Privately. Quietly. Appeals to family were redirected to advisors. Appeals to history were answered with precedent. Appeals to modernity were met with silence. Because modernity does not outrank continuity when continuity is threatened. What Harry had never fully grasped was that the monarchy is not a family that happens to rule. It is a system that happens to include a family. When the two come into conflict, the system always wins. The final administrative actions unfolded without fanfare. Websites were updated. Records adjusted. References removed. Not replaced. Not corrected. Removed. The effect was unsettling in its simplicity. Where there had once been certainty, there was now nothing. And nothing, in institutional terms, is definitive. The public reaction was muted at first, then confused, then polarized. But polarization did not matter. The decision did not require consensus. It required legality. And legality had been satisfied. Commercial consequences followed swiftly. Deals built on proximity to royal status do not survive the loss of that status. Contracts quietly stalled. Partnerships paused. Interest cooled. Influence evaporated. Not because of scandal, but because of irrelevance. Power does not disappear with noise. It disappears with disconnection. For Meghan, the silence was louder than any rebuttal could have been. Threats lose potency when the audience they rely on no longer exists. Diaries, allegations, revelations, all depend on leverage. Leverage depends on status. When status is unresolved, leverage dissolves. The donor's emergence, the legal reviews, the constitutional clarifications, all of it converged into a single outcome that no amount of narrative control could reverse. The story was no longer about who said what, or who felt wronged. It was about whether the line of succession could be challenged again in the same way. And the answer, after the Crown's intervention, was no. This is the quiet brutality of institutional power. It does not need to be loud to be final. It does not need to persuade to prevail. It simply defines the terms under which reality is recognized, and lets everything else fall away. Prince Harry's final realization, according to those close to him, was not that he had lost. It was that he had misunderstood the nature of the thing he was fighting. He believed the monarchy could be pressured, shamed, modernized into compliance. What he learned instead was that it adapts by subtraction, not concession. The Crown did not break him publicly. It did not humiliate him. It did something far more devastating. It rendered his central claim, relevance through lineage, legally inert. And once that happened, the story ended. Not with outrage. Not with closure. But with absence. Because the monarchy does not end scandals by confronting them. It ends them by ensuring they can never happen again. And when the system moves on, it does so without looking back.